Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Symposium Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage. Good afternoon to our students who are following us through our in-house Canvas program. Good afternoon to those following us on social media. Thanks to all the groups who always are very kind, Facebook groups related to the Portuguese culture. We're also, as I said, always very kind to also share so we can reach a wider audience as well. Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage, the symposium that we began here in the Central Valley in California in the year of 1990. It was an online, before it was online, I should say. It was an in-person event between 1990 and 2002. It was a 10-year project that turned out to be a 12-year project. And then with the pandemic, we brought it back as part of the California State University Fresno PBBI Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute program for our conference and lecture series. And so we gather at the confluence of memory and vision, where the winds of the Atlantic carry the voices of the islands, resilient, creative, and eternal. Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage is more than a symposium, at least we'd like to think of it that way. It is a living mosaic of heritage, a tribute to the enduring spirit of the Azorean people and their diaspora voyages across the Americas, from California to Brazil, from the east coast of the United States to the east coast of Canada, from classrooms to live streams. We braid together the threads of culture, intellect, and creativity. Our vision for the symposium is cultivating a space where the Azorean soul can speak in many tongues through poetry, prose, scholarship, journalism, history, performance, and conversation. Doing so ignites a transatlantic dialogue that affirms identity, that honors ancestry, and inspires the future. The purpose of this gathering of the Filamentos Transatlântica, or Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage, is threefold: to celebrate the Azorean legacy in its many forms, to engage generations across the diaspora in a meaningful dialogue and artistic and historic expression, and to build enduring structures of knowledge, visibility, and also empowerment. So, welcome to each and every one of you. We're very happy to have this section here for many reasons that this next presentation is dear to our heart. First of all, it is about a book that we just published through Bruma Publications, and I'll put it up here so all of you can see it. And you've seen it, of course, at different outlets that we have through PBBI. The author is Joel Silveira Avila, and he was born in Futais da Piedade on the beautiful island of Pico. It is my second favorite island in the Azores. I shouldn't say the first one is Terceira, where I'm from. People always know that that's what they think. Well, your island is, of course, your preference. But I love all of the 9 islands, but one of them that is very close to my heart is Flores. And then by beauty, I have Pico number 2, and then I have Terceira number 3. For obvious reasons, or else I get expelled from the island. Together with his parents, João Pereira Ávila and Leonela Silveira Ávila, he immigrated to the United States in 1963 at the age of 7. Joel holds a BA, MBA, and JD, all from the University of Massachusetts. He is married to the former Susan Bedard, and they have 3 children and 3 grandchildren. He recently retired from a career in information technology and was active in local government as an elected member of the planning board in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. He is the author of the article The Dabneys on Pico, a Forgotten Heritage, which was published in the 2023 edition of the Boletim Núcleo Cultural de Horta. We were approached to consider publishing this book. We are very, very happy in that we did. Again, it's called Shades of Black and Gray. As you can see there, an inquiry into the island of Pico and its history. It's available through PBBI, and hopefully after today's presentation, many of you will want to get it, whether you're from Pico or not. So, Mr. Avila, welcome to PBBI at Fresno State, albeit virtually, hopefully in the fall in person. We welcome you and we thank you for all your work on this book, and congratulations and welcome again.
Thank you, Dinesh. It's impossible for me to thank everyone who helped me with this book, with this project, but I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you especially, and Burma Publishing for undertaking a risk of publishing this book. And I'd also like to thank Unazim Almeida, who's probably not on this call, but he wrote the preface to the book, and he also encouraged me and advised me during the entire project. So thanks to him as well. So I am trying to advance the slide, and hopefully I can do this.
Sure. And as I was saying, Onesimu, of course, is the one that approached us, and in Onesimu style, who I've known for 40 years, told me you need to publish this book, and I'm glad we did. So here we
Well,
are.
very good.
And we're looking forward to your presentation, of course.
Here we go. Okay, so the agenda for today's presentation is that I'm going to say a little bit about the book, and then try to touch on 5 major topics. The first one being a brief introduction to the Azores and the island peak. And this is going to be very basic, and it's designed for people who don't really know very much about the Azores and peak. And then talk a little bit about peak wine. Unfortunately, we won't be having any tonight, but we can just talk about it. And then talk about the Dabneys on peak, whaling, and there are a few subtopics within whaling, and then immigration. Again, there's a few subtopics. The presentation is not about me, and I've tried to make the book not about me, so it's not one of these rags to riches story about, boy from the Azores makes good in America. So I've tried to be as objective as possible. But in this presentation, I have included some photos of my family that I hope will serve as an illustration to the topics, and particularly within immigration. So a little bit about the book. It took me 4 years to research and to write it. I have plenty of excuses for how long it took, including the fact that my knowledge of Portuguese is poor, even though I was born in the Azores and I was 7 when I immigrated. It's basically a second grade education without having really exercised it for 70 years. So it's not a good combination. But to be fair, the book covers a period of 600 years, so it took a while to research. The format is a series of questions and answers on 40 different topics. And it's the topics that were of most interest to me, and I hope they're topics that are of interest to other people. So one of the questions I get asked from time to time from people that are not familiar with the Azores are, where are the Azores? And certainly this is very basic, but the Azores are 2/3 of the way between the US and Portugal in the North Atlantic. They're a group of 9 Portuguese islands that are semi-autonomous. And from one of today's presentations, I didn't realize how controversial that autonomy could be, but I get a flavor for that. And it's approximately the same latitude as Washington, D.C. and Lisbon. So but it is warmed by the Gulf Stream, so we get some temperate days, especially in the summer. The distance between the most northerly island, which is Corvo, and the most southerly island of Santa Maria is approximately 373 miles. And then to follow that up, I get asked, well, where's the island of Pico? And you can see that Pico is right dab in the middle of the central group of islands in the Azores. And it is a dormant volcano over 7,700 feet, which makes it the tallest mountain in Portugal. Area-wise, it's only São Miguel is larger in area than Pico. Pico and Faial are the closest of all of the Azorean islands. Only 6 kilometers separate them across a narrow channel. Piku is approximately 28.5 miles long and 10 miles wide at its broadest point. It generally takes me about an hour to travel by car from Piedad to Medellina, which are the two extreme ends of the island, to give you an idea of the distance as well. It has a population of just under 14,000, which is only 6% of the total population in the Azores. So even though it's second in area, it has low population relative to the entire Azores, with the bulk of the population being in San Miguel. And the island has 3 municipalities and 17 parishes, civil parishes. This is a photo, one of my favorite photos of Peak, of Peak's first municipality, Lodge Peak, which was incorporated around 1500, even though there's no formal charter that's been discovered. And then we have Peak's second municipality on the northern side of the island, which faces São Jorge, and that was incorporated in 1542. And then we have the third and final municipality, which is Medellina, incorporated in 1715, and this faces Fayal. And traditionally, it's been dominated by the city of Horta in Fayal. Moving on to briefly to the settlement of Peak. It's important to note that what we're talking about here is settlement and not discovery, since discovery would have been earlier and is a much different discussion. So estimates they vary widely between 1416 and 1500 based on in terms of when the first settlers arrived on Peak. But there's significant evidence that point to settlement starting around 1460. And the first settler, I think there's a consensus, was Fernando Alves. And that settlement took place in 3 distinct waves. The first wave was by individuals who arrived on the south coast of Peak at Lage and were likely from the island of Ceuta. And about 10 years later, settlers from either Graciosa or São Jorge, or maybe both, arrived on the north coast and founded São Roque. And the third and final wave of the early settlers occurred in São Mateus near Medellina after the captain of Fayal, Huerta, also became the captain of Peak. So moving on to Peak wine, Pico wine, according to tradition, grapes were first introduced on Pico by the Franciscan friar Pedro Gigante. He is said to have arrived with the first settlers near Lage and served as the first priest on Pico at the chapel of St. Peter in Lage. Traditionally, there were 2 types of Pico wine. One was Vinho Comum, which was a dry table wine, and then Vinho Passado, which was a higher quality sweet wine. The climate on Pico allowed for growing at least a dozen varieties of grapes, including the Verdelho, which was dominant on Pico. The friars were the ones who first mastered the secret recipe for the traditional Pico wine. Secret because there are no bottles left of the old wine, so we can only imagine what it tasted like. But it's believed that the traditional wine was a blend of Verdelho as its main base, and then Alicante, Boal, Malvasia, Cercial, and Bastardo. So it was really a mixture of various varieties, with Verdelho being the main ingredient. During the 1700s, wine was so important to Peak that it generated 80% of the tax revenues. But unfortunately, the industry came to a screeching halt during the 1850s. First thing that happened was the powdery mildew attacked the grapevines, and it arrived in the summer of 1852. It consisted of a white powder that covered grapes from the first bloom. They turned brown and finally black. This caused many residents to abandon their vineyards and leave the island. And large homes were sold at really for next to nothing, leaving Pico in a state of calamity. Then, adding insult to injury, the phylloxera insect arrived on peak in 1873. This caused less damage than the mildew had, but just made a bad situation even worse. The annual production on peak of wine was estimated to range between 12,000 and 15,000 barrels before the blights, but some estimates were as high as 25,000 barrels. Incredibly, by 1867, the production had been reduced to less than 100 barrels. Residents had to resort to planting Isabella and other American varieties to make up for it. These varieties were more resistant to the blights, but they were definitely lower quality. So that by 1891, 80% of the wine produced on peak consisted of American varieties. And so we have here a photo of the UNESCO World Heritage Site showing the Pico vineyards in the Medellina. And this also coincidentally is an area that was very close to where the Dabney family had their vineyards in the 1800s. And that's our next topic is the Dabneys on Peak, as well as California. Most people familiar with the Dabneys know about them because of their presence on Fayal, but the family had very strong ties to Pico as well. In fact, I think you could make the argument that it was Pico wine that first attracted John Bass Dabney to the Azores for reasons that we won't get into here. But the Dabneys were so influential in 19th century in the Azores that they were dubbed that particular time period in Azores history has been called the Dabney century. The family consisted of 3 generations of American consuls over a period of 21 American presidents from Thomas Jefferson to Garfield. They provided supplies to ships, especially American whale ships. They transported passengers and freight between Boston and Horta. They encouraged the Azoreans to send out their own whale ships. They were very instrumental in the introduction of shore whaling on Peak that we will get to in a couple of minutes. And they, probably most importantly, in my mind, they provided grain to the islanders during years of famine, a contribution that they're still remembered for, and that included the parish of Piedad, where my family's from, and where I'm from as well. With regards to Peak, they also purchased substantial vineyards and a summer cottage in Area Larga, which they named the Priory because it had once been owned by the Carmelite monks. And so the exact location of this priory has been somewhat of a mystery. And in fact, it was misidentified in the Vieira book about the Dabneys. This is a beautiful book of photography, but unfortunately it identified the wrong structure as being the priory. So locating this structure became a sort of a personal quest for me during this project. What we have here is a sketch of the priory from 1843 by Samuel Longfellow. You might recognize his more famous brother, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Samuel tutored the Dabney children on Peak and Fayal for a period of, say, 2 years between 1843 and 1844. And during this time, he drew sketches of Pico and Fayal and wrote letters home describing his stays at the priory, including a couple of them that he actually illustrated with with his interpretation of what the priory looked like. And this photograph here is as part of the collection of in the Horta Public Library, and it served as sort of a Rosetta Stone for me in identifying the specific location for the priory, because you can probably see at the bottom left-hand corner there's a label that says the priory, and it lines up very nicely with the structure that's at the upper left-hand corner, which in fact is the summer cottage, the Dabney summer cottage called the Priory. So armed with that information, one can go into the Dabney album that's stored at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and pick out several other photographs that include the Priory. So these are a couple of my favorite photographs. The one on the left is a couple of washerwomen showing the Priory at the left-hand side. And then the one on the right is a Pico woman carrying a jug of water. And again, the Priory is at the left-hand side of the photograph. One of the Dabney family members was Frances Susan Dabney. She was born in Fayal and was a niece of Samuel Willis Dabney, the last Dabney consul. She is probably famous now for a book of poetry in prose entitled Saudade, which has been published fairly recently in both English and Portuguese, as well as a separate poem that she entitled The Priory. And I'll just read this last stanza. Amid the vines and the fruit trees, on the rugged surf-bound coast, through the storms and calms of ages, stands the Priory, Pico's boast. So this gives you some idea, I think, or some flavor for how important the summer cottage was to the Dabneys, as many summer cottages were important to other people in the Azores and on Peak. Then we have yet another photograph from the New Bedford Whaling Museum collection. And this is significant because it refers to a structure as the house that belonged to Uncle Antonio Chatinha. And this was driving me crazy for a while until I finally talked to a few folks who were familiar with the Chatinha family and helped me resolve where this was specifically. So it turns out that the Casa do Tio Antonio Chatinha is actually the Priory after the Dabneys left the Azores. And so once they left, people referred to it, referring to the name of the people who owned it. And that person was Tio Antonio Chatinha. So to get to the Chatinha part of the story, one needs to know that the Priory was owned by a general, Antonio Mariano Cesar Oliveira Ribeiro from Madalena. And he was married to Amelia Ernestina Avelar, a poet who wrote Ensaios Poéticos. So she's got a beautiful poem about Pico, which I didn't include here, but it came as news to me that she was a poet. The writer Ernesto Rebelo from Fayal described her work as, quote, inspired by the sweetest feeling of the soul and perhaps the splendid panoramas that nature offers on that volcanic island. Now, they had a daughter whose name was Auda Avelar Cesar, who was born in Luanda in Angola, and she returned to Pico and tutored young people, reading and writing, children or young adults who didn't have the benefit of an education. And the reason she was in Luanda was because her father, being in the military, was stationed there. So she was born in Africa. When she returned to Pico, she became romantically involved with one of her students, whose name was Antonio Joaquim Medeiros Jr. And he was from the Chatinha fishing family in Arialaga. Now, Chatinha was a nickname, one of these families with a nickname. And so I spoke to one of the family members, and we got into a discussion about what Chatinha means. And apparently it has many meanings. And some of them are not always, very pleasant. But it also refers to, he believed, a part of a boat. So because they were a poor fishing family, they began to be called Chatinhas. And so there's a story in the family that Antonio, the individual who was being tutored, was so enamored with Auda that he would row from Maria Larga to Fayal in basically a dinghy to see his girlfriend, Auda. And so I don't know if this is true. There obviously wouldn't be any documentation on this, but it's an interesting story. So despite their very different social statuses, he was from a very poor fishing family, and she was the daughter of a general and very well educated. Despite that, they were married in 1905, with the priory going to the couple as part of Auda's wedding dowry. But I have to say that the consensus is that it was over her father's objections that they got married. So this is a real true love story. The priory continued to be owned by the Chatinga family, and it's interesting that sometimes it's spelled with an X and sometimes with a CH. That family continued to own the priory until it was sold in the early 1960s to make room for the tuna factory, which is now closed. And so here we have a drawing of the priory from around 1960, before it was the major project took place to basically chop it in half, the tuna factory. And this was drawn by the architect Carlos Garcia, who was actually instrumental in the design and the project to remodel the priory. So this was the last time that it actually looked like it did originally, around 1960. And here we have a portrait of Samuel Willis Dabney, who was the third and the final American consul. He had a son, Herbert, who was educated at MIT and was appointed vice consul, but soon he gave up that position. It didn't last very long in Fayal, and he moved to California. Samuel himself left the Azores with the remaining family members, and there weren't that many, in January 1892, when it was no longer financially viable for the Dabneys to remain there. And some of the family members settled in the States in California or near Santa Barbara. Herbert, the son, had bought property in the San Diego area in the mid-1880s, one of the properties he called Fayal Ranch, and it was at, quote, the foot of the mountains inland from San Diego. So those of you from that area might recognize where that is. And this is where his father, Samuel, retired after they left Fayal. Herbert was also president of a small railroad running daily trips between La Jolla and San Diego. So definitely some connections here between the Dabneys and Southern California. And one other important Dabney was Roxana Lewis Dabney. She was the daughter of the second consul, Charles W. Dabney. Those of you who have been in Magdalena and have seen the Rua Carlos Dabney, that was named after the second consul, Charles Dabney. According to her niece, Frances, Roxana was the unofficial queen of the priory on Peak, serving as the perfect hostess, ensuring that guests were graciously welcomed and entertained. And so, again, this is a reflection of the importance that the priory on Peak had. The Dabney family, where they would entertain their family and VIPs, mostly from the U.S., who visited, and oftentimes the priory served as sort of a point where they would start their climb of the mountain when they wanted to climb the mountain. Roxana was one of the final Dabneys who was left in Fayal and departed Fayal with her brother in January of 1892. In 1898, she compiled and wrote the Annals of the Dabney family in Fayal, which is an important collection of family letters and documents that describe the Dabneys' life on Pico and Fayal during the early 1800s through the mid-1800s, and there are a number of references to the priory in there. She spent some more time in Boston, then moved to Santa Barbara to be near her sister, and died in 1913. In a testimonial to Roxana, her niece Frances wrote that in her garden in Santa Barbara, she would often stand still and gaze wistfully at the high range above the foothills, and then with shining eyes would repeat her favorite psalm. So again, a definite connection to Southern California. Next, we turn to the role of Azoreans in American whaling. We know that American whaling ships were first documented off of the Azores in the mid, I believe that's 1760s. I think I got. Can you see that, Denise? Does that say 1760s on the slide?
Yes, 1760s.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
I should remember that from memory, but just wanted to make sure. But it really wasn't until 1808 that the first two Azoreans were documented on American whale ships. There was documentation that they were actually aboard. And those two whale ships were from New Bedford, the Maria and the Sally. The two individuals were Emmanuel Joseph, who was 17 years old from Peak, and Joseph Rose, who was from Flush. The presence of Azoreans in the American whale fishery rose from about 40% during the 1800s. And so these are very rough averages given the number of years involved here, to about 60% by 1920. But the point is that the percentage of Azoreans kept rising in the on American whale ships, as coincidentally the number of whale ships also declined. By the end of 1920s, the majority of ships had Portuguese captains, and at least 8 of the captains had been from the island of Peak and are highlighted specifically in the book. I think it's fair to say that, generally speaking, the most successful whalers were those who left the island as cabin boys at an early age and were able to learn the language and assimilate in America. So this was true of whalers as it was for generally immigrants. So here we have a photograph, which probably many of you have seen, but it's of whale ships in the Bay of Horta around 1890. Again, as the number of whale ships had already declined by this period. I think earlier, 1840, 50, there would have been many more whale ships in the harbor. And then we have a newspaper ad that puts whalers on notice that there are supplies to be had in Medellina on Peak, including fruits and vegetables. And then this is an illustration from Scribner's from 1873, showing stowaways boarding American whale ships. And this is called Immigration de Salto. So next we'll turn to California shore whaling. This is a topic that came as a surprise to me that I knew nothing about before I started this project. But as gold became harder to find in the early 1850s, many of the former whalers looked to shore whaling for their livelihood in California. In 1854, a former whaler, John Davenport, organized a crew of Portuguese at Monterey and began shore whaling at around the same time that shore whaling began in Azores. And whaling stations quickly appeared along the entire coast of California from Crescent City to San Diego. And this industry lasted until the end of the 1800s and was largely dominated by Azoreans. There were 26 whaling stations that operated during the second half of the 19th century, including Portuguese Bay. A number of the California whalers were from the island of Peak. In 1860, of the 16 members of the old Monterey Whaling Company, all were Portuguese, with 14 being from the Azores, including 2 of them that were specifically identified from the island of Peak. But there actually could have been more, because 5 of the 16 were identified generically as having been born in the Azores. So we don't know which island they came from. We have Joseph Prey, whose Portuguese name was José Pereira da Costa, who came to California in 1863 and was a native of São Roque and Pico. He came at an early age on a New England whaling vessel. And because of his experience of more than 15 years, Prey assumed command of the old Monterey Whaling Company in 1863-64. Many of the early pioneers in Point Loma were also from the island of Peak, and some number of them also returned to Peak. So, for example, in 1882, Manuel Silveira Soares came from Peak along with José Soares Henriques and José Miquelino, and all of them returned to Peak in 1890, which was not an unusual occurrence for whalers who came to the U.S. Next, turning to the shore whaling in the Azores. During the second half of the 1800s, shore whaling was initiated on all of the 9 islands in the Azores, and there were multiple whaling stations in a very competitive situation against one another. The whaling is believed to have started in Flores and Fayal around 1860, Corfu in 1874, and then Peak only in 1876. This industry in the Azores was enhanced because of the sharp decline in American whaling, the return to the islands of men with much experience as whalers, and the relatively low cost of setting up coastal operations compared to investing in costly ships. In a letter from 1883, Samuel Dabney, who we already talked about, wrote that there was not a single parish on the islands of Fayal, Peak, Flores, and Corfu that did not have returned whalers, some of whom had been promoted to shipwrights and officers in the American whale fishery. This shore whaling required whale boats with their associated tools, including harpoons, tripods for boiling whale blubber, barrels for storing whale oil, and these were all initially imported from New Bedford. It wasn't until the 1890s that the whale boats were made locally on Peak. By the end of the 1800s, Peak had become the capital of whaling in the Azores, and whaling dominated the lives of many families on the island. There were 2 main phases, each of about 50 years. The first period was from 1870 to 1930, and has been characterized as one of pure cooperation, where the whalers were both shareholders and crew in the operation. They were organized into small associations, and they not only hunted for the whales, but they also processed the whales at their own individual whaling stations. And then the second phase from 1930 to 1980 has been categorized as one where consolidation took place, with the whalers losing control of the industry. And it was the factories at Lage and Saint Roch that applied industrial technology, and they were able to process the entire whale, so a much more efficient process. During the 1920s, the launches, which are motorized towboats, were first introduced. And this was significant because it eliminated much of the time and effort of rowing from shore to the whales, and then manually towing the whales back to port, which I can't even imagine must have been a tremendous effort. In 1935, the industry employed approximately a total of 250 men on the island of Peak. And so what we have here is a bust of Captain Anselmo de Silveira. He was a naturalized American citizen who returned from the American whale fishery to where he was born in the parish of Quillota de Nchking. He partnered with Samuel Willis Dabney, which by now should be a familiar name, and Samuel's son-in-law, George Oliver, to establish the first official whaling company in the Azores. So there might be disagreement about, where people were whaling, on which islands and where whaling first occurred, but there's no question that the first official whaling company started in April of 1876 on Peak. And the contract still exists. And under that contract, the Dabneys provided a whaleboat and equipment, and Captain Anselmo assumed responsibility for that whaleboat and obtained a local crew. So here's a photograph of whalers from Quillota de Nchking around 1970. And a couple of photos of the whale factory in Saint Roch around the same period. Shore whaling officially ended in the Azores in 1984, largely due to international prohibitions on whaling. But by then, what many people don't realize is that most of the whalers had already immigrated to the U.S. and Canada, or they were already too old to go out whaling. Next, we turn to immigration and return from the U.S. The main causes of immigration, as you might expect, is that poverty and the poor economic conditions led people to search for a better life elsewhere. And a secondary cause was avoiding military service in the Portuguese Army. Brazil was actually the first destination for Azoreans, starting as early as the 1600s. So what we have here is people just getting to the Azores and already leaving in the 1600s. The shift to the U.S. only began in the 1800s when the American whaling ships arrived. In 1803, an observer astutely noted that Azoreans who couldn't work as farmers only had two options. They could either join the church or immigrate. And in fact, many did immigrate. Immigration was so common that by 2021, Pico's population was barely half of what it had been in 1866, before the blights in the vineyards. There were three main phases of immigration. During the first phase, from 1840s to 1870s, immigrants departed, as we mentioned earlier, as stowaways de salto on whaling ships. New immigrants found work on New England fishing boats, as well as farms in California. In New Bedford, there were so many Azoreans that Water Street became known as Little Fayal. Many were attracted to immigrate because of the California gold rush. And so one example is Manuel Amin Garcia, who was brother to my great-great-grandmother. He came to California on a whaler in 1856 and returned to Peak around 1876 with some gold as, quote, a wealthy bachelor. This was according to his granddaughter. He was the first member of my family over 6 generations who immigrated to the U.S. and then returned to Peak, which is, I think, pretty incredible that 6 generations of people came to here in one family and then returned to Peak. His son, Antonio Amin Garcia, was born on Peak, and he later immigrated to Fairhaven, Massachusetts around 1904. In 1857, at the Seaman's Bethel in New Bedford, which is very famous for its setting of the beginning of Moby Dick, the Reverend Moses Howe was very active in helping whalers, and he was also determined to convert Catholic whalers to Protestants. On August 22nd of that year, he wrote in his journal that a Portuguese who was lately returned from the sea and been converted on the bark Bell of Fairhaven spoke and prayed at the Bethel. He appears to be a very excellent man. He is a native of Peak and wants to go home to tell the people what the Lord has done for his soul and try to do good among children by learning them to read the Bible. So here's an example of someone from Peak who had converted from being Catholic to being Protestant. And on another personal note, my great-grandfather, Manuel Joaquim de Silveira, who was also from Quillota and Ski, stowed away on the New Bedford whale ship Napoleon during its voyage of 1881. And his departure is straight out of Dias de Melo, Pedras Negras, and could easily have been the model for the story, especially since the setting was in the parish of Quillota and Ski. I'm not suggesting that it was the model, but it could well have been. There were probably very similar stories that occurred to many other people, many other men who stowed away on whale ships. Manuel arrived at Santa Barbara County, and after 10 years of working as a fisherman, he was naturalized as a U.S. citizen. At some point, and we don't know when, he became Protestant and returned to Peak. But we know this because he was charged with singing a Protestant hymn at a funeral for a 5-year-old boy on Peak in 1902. But he couldn't be tried because by then he was in the U.S. again. So I guess he didn't stay long enough for the authorities or the taxman to get a hold of him. And so here's a photograph of my Protestant great-grandparents. This is Manuel Joaquim de Silveira and his wife, Mariana Joaquina de Silveira. from Calheta de Nisquim. They were married in Boston by a justice of the peace in 1903 and promptly returned to Peak to raise their family. They had 3 children on Peak. The son Manuel, who was deaf and mute and was known as Tio Mudo, but he was extremely talented, very artistic. He was also a blacksmith, but he never immigrated. Then there was daughter Maria Joaquina, who immigrated to New Bedford around 1916 and worked as a domestic. She became a Baptist and never returned to Peak. And then there was my grandmother, Rosa Joaquina, who immigrated very much later in 1961 with the bulk of our family to New Bedford, and later returned to Peak with my grandfather to raise her family, and she raised them as Seventh-day Adventists. I'm sorry, she returned to Peak with my grandfather to live, but earlier when the family was growing up, she raised them as Seventh-day Adventists. I think one of the lessons to be taken from this is that Azoreans had practically lost their Catholic faith because there were no Portuguese-speaking clergy in the U.S. So as a result, Azoreans in New Bedford begged or demanded, depending on your perspective, that the bishops send them a Portuguese priest. By the time the priest arrived in New Bedford in 1869, he observed that many of the Azoreans had been rebaptized or had their children baptized in Anglican churches. So the priest who arrived was Father João Inácio de Azevedo Encarnação, otherwise known as Ignatius, from the parish of Piedade on Peak, coincidentally the same parish that I'm from. And on September 10th, he founded the first Portuguese parish in the U.S., St. John the Baptist in New Bedford. He was one of several priests from Peak who were instrumental in opening several Catholic churches and Portuguese parishes in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And then in California, Father Manuel Francisco Fernandes, and another immigrant from Peak, was asked in 1891 to build the first Portuguese church in California, which was St. Joseph's in Oakland. That church was inaugurated in 1892. The parish was created, and Father Fernandes was appointed its pastor. Unfortunately, he died soon after that, and his church was, as it was called, was then turned over to an Italian order in 1902. And then we have Father Guilherme Silveira de Gloria, who was pastor in San Leandro for a decade. He was also born on Peak, but in his case, the parish of Candelaria. He preached to various missions and at festivals at the many locations where the Portuguese had settled. And in 1885, he was appointed pastor for San Pablo and was transferred to the church at St. Joseph's. However, during the summer of 1899, he left the priesthood and was married in a civil ceremony. During the second phase of immigration from the 1870s to the 1920s, Azorean immigrants took advantage of different occupations. For the most part, immigrants to the East Coast worked in textile mills. Now, this wasn't universally true. There were also farming that took place, but generally speaking, the new immigrants worked in the textile mills. Azoreans in California found employment in farming and livestock and fishing. By 1887, there were 8,000 Portuguese living in California. During the early 1900s, many of these Azoreans eventually became independent farmers. And by 1910, there were 28,000 Portuguese immigrants living in San Francisco County alone, distributed in San Francisco, Oakland, and Monterey. And so maybe some of you have heard the story of Lorenzo Avila, who's better known, Lorenzo Oliveira, who's better known as Lawrence Oliver. He was born in March of 1887 in also in Calheta de Nisquim. And we know a lot about him because of his story is documented in a biography entitled Never Backward. He was the youngest of 4 children, and he had a very poor and unhappy childhood. His father immigrated when he was first born, and it would be 4 years before the father would return. Lawrence himself left for New Bedford when he turned 16. By the time he died in 1977, he was one of the richest and most distinguished figures in the Portuguese American community in the city of San Diego and in all of California. In his book, he describes some of the history of the first Portuguese who settled in San Diego in 1876, and specifically in Point Loma. According to Lawrence, these men were all from the island of Pico, the individuals that he identified. And he claimed that this group had first landed and settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Later, some of them went to Half Moon Bay in the San Francisco area, and eventually they made their way to San Diego. And then we have another example of American immigrant, Manuel A. Silva Jr., who was my first cousin twice removed, also born in Quilheta in 1895. He's not famous like Lawrence Oliver, but in my mind, he's probably more typical. He's a more typical immigrant in California than perhaps Lawrence Oliver was. And he represents the California branch of my extended family that immigrated from Peak, but unlike my East Coast family, this branch remained in California and didn't return to Peak. His father was born also in Quilheta in 1866, and he sailed to Gloucester when he was 18. He became a U.S. citizen and then returned to Peak. There he married 16-year-old Yolinda Adelaide Silvader in 1893. But he always thought about another trip to the U.S., especially since he was an American citizen. So Manuel's father returned to the U.S., this time leaving his wife with 5 children. He traveled to Point Conception in Santa Barbara County, and he was involved in lobster fishing, shipping lobsters and crates to San Francisco fish markets. He returned to Pico again in 1902, where his family grew to 10 children by 1912. And he had a daughter, Carmina, who was the only one of his 11 children to be born in the U.S. I mentioned her because she was fortunate for us that she wrote down all of the details of Manuel Silva's life in a biography that was a short biography that was never published. In June of 1912, Manuel and his older sister left for the U.S. with their father, destined for San Jose. They sailed in filthy conditions with livestock at the bottom of a ship, and their meals consisted of macaroni 3 times a day. I guess that's okay if you like macaroni, but doesn't sound very appealing to me. They 5.5 days later, they arrived in Providence, and they were met by Manuel's 2 aunts who took them to buy shoes. They then left on a 5-day trip to San Francisco with only bananas, breakfast, lunch, and supper. So I don't know. I suppose bananas might be better than macaroni. I'm not sure. They arrived in San Francisco and boarded a bus to San Jose, where they stayed with Manuel's aunt. And in just a few days, Manuel's father left his 2 children to go work on bean farms, telling them, after I get enough money, I'm going back to the Azores for your mother if she needs me, which sounds like a real understatement, having all those kids back on Peak. But by 1914, the rest of the family arrived from Peak when they reunited at the Oakland train depot. Manuel was initially employed washing fruit at a fruit cannery and later got a job working on a farm, and he was never without a job in California. He was married to his wife in 1921 at the Church of St. Mary in Gilroy, and he would go on to have 4 sons. When he couldn't sell his apricots at the start of the Great Depression in 1928, they packed up their car with the dog, the canary, and 2 children and moved to India Street in San Diego. Then in January of 1929, the family moved to an apartment in Point Loma owned by a Lawrence Oliver. And I'm thinking this is perhaps the same Oliver from Peak that we already talked about. Manuel began fishing in 1928 and only stopped after 30 consecutive years. And he celebrated his 100th birthday in 1995 at the Point Loma American Legion Hall, where he had been instrumental in organizing the council and had served as its secretary for 38 years. And so here we have a poor photo, but this is of me talking to Manuel, and Manuel not being very interested in what I have to say. At any rate, this was at his 100th birthday party. My wife and I were fortunate to make that event. And then we have another example of immigrants during this period. It's my paternal grandfather, Fortunato Antonio Avila. Now the picture is not of my grandfather, as you can plainly see. I don't have a picture of him, but pictured here are his wife, my grandmother, Rosa Pereira das Vezes, on the left, with her sister Teresa, and it was taken in Fortaleza de Piedade on Pico. So my grandfather not immigrated to California around 1910, we're not sure exactly which year, and then returned to Pico, where he married my grandmother in 1916. We know that he was in California because he brought back a copy of a Sacramento newspaper called Libertad, and that was dated May 13th, 1913. And then he also brought back various photographs of people from Chico, Sacramento, and San Francisco, presumably these were his friends, or maybe even some relatives. And then he also brought back encomendas, mementos from various people in California to give to their friends and relatives. Rosa's, my grandmother's sister, Teresa, who's also pictured here. She also immigrated and married Manuel Silveira Soto in New Bedford in 1921. And she returned to Pico and later moved to Fayal. But an interesting side note is that the condition that she gave for accepting Manuel's marriage proposal was that he returned to Pico with her so that they could take care of her family, which she agreed to, and they became a happy couple and had a family. And then Teresa's son would later immigrate to Rhode Island. And then the third major phase of Azorean immigration started up again in the early 1960s and continued until the late 1900s. It was initially driven by the Kiplingers volcano on Fayal in 1958. That resulted in 1,500 visas being issued to residents of Fayal and Pico. And then the Immigration Act of 1965 enabled the departure of thousands of other Azoreans to America. They arrived in areas already occupied by earlier immigrants, and this reinforced the traditional Portuguese culture in these communities. So an example, again, in my family, my maternal grandparents immigrated to New Bedford in 1961, where their single children and later sent for the married ones, including my parents and me. So this is one of my favorite pictures because it represents that side of the family, my mother's side of the family, before any of them had immigrated from Pico. And I especially like it because of the expressions on people's faces. And obviously you don't know them, but they reflect their personalities very well. So we have here my maternal grandparents, Rosa Joaquina de Silveira, and my grandfather, Leonel Lorenzo Avila. They had 8 children on Pico. Of the 8, 7 of them immigrated to the U.S., and 3 of them later returned to Pico to live. And so to me, this is an example of the mass immigration that took place in the Azores, and in this case on Pico during the 1960s, that just devastated the population. And I couldn't resist a photo of my parents on their wedding day. They were married in 1947. They owned a general store and a milk collection station for the local dairy in Fortaleza de Piedade. They immigrated in 1963 and returned to Pico to live in 1973. And so I think most people are aware there were both positive and negative impacts of immigration. This is certainly one of the negative impacts where there are houses on Pico that have been abandoned, and there are many like this throughout the island. So to close this out, in my mind, the history of Pico is also an American story. As we've talked about, the Dabney family had intimate ties to Pico during the Dabney century, and they maintained an ongoing bridge to the U.S., eventually many of them settling in California. There were many experienced whalers from Pico who returned from the U.S., bringing American whaling skills and capital to Pico. And as a further example of this, when Joseph Buller climbed Pico in 1839, one of his guides spoke English, demonstrating that the guide had already returned from the U.S., where he had learned English. These returning immigrants had a significant impact on Pico's economy, language, culture, and architecture. And it's now difficult to find Pico residents who don't have family members either in New England, California, or Toronto. So we have here just a photo of the cover art for the book, and I welcome you to send me any questions, comments, and corrections. I've included my email address here, joelavila.law@gmail.com, and I'll try to respond as best I can. So that's it. Back to you, Denise.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Fascinating presentation indeed. Thank you. I have one student who actually sent me a note and a question, and he asked the he asked me how the book was, and I was trading some information with him, and the book has unbelievable great bibliography, and it's as Onesimo said in his email to the folks that he sends on a regular basis. It's a calhamaço, which is a Portuguese word for a large book. Uh, and so it's a calhamaço. It is a large book, very readable though. But the question from the student was, what drove you to, this is quote unquote, what drove you to tackle this for as long as you did and to do this project?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think my wife might say it was insanity that drove me to do this, but um, yeah, I was born on the island of Peak, and I always had an interest in finding out more about it. I didn't know anything about its history. So I worked at an old bookshop when I was going to college, and I collected a few old books about the Azores and even considered writing something about the Azores at the time. But the more I looked into it, the Azores seemed to be too broad of a topic, and I think there's been a considerable amount of material written about the Azores, but not so much about a specific island and specifically Peak. So when I retired 7 years ago, I considered what I might do to fill my time, and writing was something that occurred to me might make some sense because it was something that I could do mostly in the privacy of my home, and other than going out to bookstores and libraries finding material. But it gave me an opportunity to reinforce this identity of being from Peak, which, even though I was born on the island, I only visited it occasionally, and I had sort of lost connection to the island over time. And so it also gave me an opportunity to learn a lot more about the island, about the Azores, and a little bit about Portugal as well, which I think was interesting to me.
One of the things that you showed on the presentation, that a comment also that I'd like to make and get your thoughts a little bit more on it as well, which is it's amazing how there was this going back and forth, in a time that transportation wasn't, exactly getting on SATA and arriving in the Azores a half hours later.
Yeah.
All this back and forth between people at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. How many people came here and were here? And because that also happened with my own grandparents. My grandfather immigrated in 1910 and sold his dairy. Little did he know that it was the perfect time to sell. Sold his dairy in 1928, 6 months before the Great Depression, and went back and actually became a pretty well-off person because, took all of his money with him. And he, of course, waited another 6 or 9 months, he would have been able to sell it, or had to hold on to it for a long time in order to sell it. But there, it seemed like if we look at the immigration, there was a lot of going back and forth in that early time, a lot because the men came by themselves, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Unlike starting in the 1960s, where entire families immigrated together, initially it was men who, um, they went as stowaways on these ships, and they were out for sometimes 3 or 4 years at a time on whaling voyages. But I think they went with the intention, many of them went with the intention of coming back and either finding their brides waiting for them, or taking care of their families for those who were already married. Now, that didn't always happen. I mean, obviously, people stayed in the U.S. and that's how the population started to grow in these Portuguese communities. But I think a lot of these stowaways went with the idea of returning. I mean, it was sort of their intention, and they made good on it.
Indeed. It's you also mentioned the one, and I'm trying to recall here. I didn't take the note of the one family member who wrote the notes about basically that person's life. It's amazing how many people and one has I at least I do have always wondered how many of these stories that people actually wrote in small pieces of paper that have gotten
Mhm.
lost within time, weren't properly archived or didn't have a way to get them obviously published. But these were such wonderful stories of their adventures, and that's unfortunately got lost, within time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm very fortunate to have come across this biography of my cousin twice removed,
And
and I wouldn't have found it if it hadn't been for his sister, who took the time to type it very neatly in a typewriter way back when, and she was very much into genealogy, having married a Mormon in I think the Bay Area somewhere. And so this caused her to have an interest in his background. She was born in the US, but uh, you know, she had an interest in learning about his life on Peak, and had an interest in recording his early life here in the US, which is why I was able to get all of that detail about a family member, which I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you know more about California than I do, but it may be fairly typical of immigrants to California.
yes, yes, indeed, indeed. Well, thank you so much once again for this magnificent presentation. We hope to see you in the fall time in person at Fresno State and throughout the valley. This, as you know, the Central San Joaquin Valley has a strong Pico community, probably one of the strongest in California, is in the Central Valley in Southern California, San Diego, and we're certainly going to try to have a way to promote the book at both of those places. So we thank you again. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for this gift to your island and to those who are Portuguese background, especially from the island. Anybody who wants to read a good story about the resilience of a people, of course, the book is available. But certainly to those who are of ancestry from the island of Pico, it's a wonderful book. It's the first of its kind that I'm aware of for one particular island of the Azores. Very well done, very complete, and with lots of information and all of it, of course, reference and cross-reference. So again, thanks for those 4 years of your life.
And
Any
thank you for all your help, Denise.
any plans to keep on writing?
I've started a second project. I don't know what will become of it, but I have an interest in the Franciscan convents on the island of Peak. There were two, and they were dissolved at the same time that all of the other religious convents were dissolved in Portugal after the Liberal Revolution. But I think there's a story there. I mean, the Franciscans were such an important part of the Azores and Peak, and I think maybe I'd like to tell that story.
Well, hopefully you will. Hopefully we can. Yes, indeed. Again, thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much and we will hopefully see you in person here in the fall, and hopefully we'll also have a book presentation in the summer. I know that lots of folks, especially here from California, spend a lot of their summer in Pico. Those who are retired, those who aren't retired, take 4 weeks off and go to Pico. And so be on the lookout because probably sometime in the summer, Joel will present his book at the in an event to be determined and to be announced soon in the beautiful island of Pico. So once again, thank you very, very much. And those of you who want to book, get a hold of us as PBBI at Fresno State, as you well know. Again, Joel, thank you so much for taking time. I appreciate it. And
Thank you.
have a great evening. Thank you so
You
much.
too.
Yeah, thank you.